Hi, and welcome to an OCI Info Session, where we're going to give you an overview of what on-campus interviewing with large firms is going to look like in January of 2021. My name is Rob Kikasi, and joining me is Amy Maddock. We're Executive Directors in the Office of Career Strategy. So to quickly give you a sense of what we're going to cover, here's the agenda for our discussion. We're going to be talking about the basics of OCI, general strategy points to consider, a little bit about the process, and then cover some important dates for you to remember. So I'm going to kick it off to Amy to discuss the general points of what OCI is.
So what is OCI? It is the largest recruiting program that Georgetown hosts. We have usually over 300 firms in various offices that interview our students over the course of several days. And over the course of those several days, we host about 6,000 interviews. The participants in OCI tend to be large law firms with national and frequently international presence. There are regional law firms who also participate, and these interviews in OCI are what are affectionately known in the industry as screening interviews or screeners. They're just short interviews, short introductory interviews where you have an opportunity to become acquainted with the employer, and the employer gets the chance to become acquainted with you. Through OCI, you will be interviewing for summer associate positions for 2021. Interviewing for summer associate jobs often leads to permanent offers. So you'll want to consider where you want to be when you graduate and what you're interested in before interviewing for summer associate positions. We'll talk about that a little bit later. In order to interview for summer associate positions, you'll be bidding on firms that you would like to meet with, and we'll talk more about what bids are in just a few minutes. Typically, the interview is 20 or 30 minutes. Usually they're 20 minutes, but a lot of the firms who are interviewing for intellectual property positions choose to have 30-minute interviews. So during this initial process of bidding, you will have 50 bids to use, and we will talk more about those bids shortly. And the maximum number of interviews that you can get through the formal quote-unquote registration process, this initial process, is 15. That doesn't necessarily mean that you will receive 15, but that's the most that you'll be able to get through the formal bidding process.
And it's worth noting that there are other methods to acquire interviews with some of the firms who are visiting. So we highlight there that through the formal process, the maximum is 15, but students may pick up interviews on their own as they navigate the labor market and try to connect with employers that are of interest. You'll see we have an asterisk next to 50 bids. You may use up to 50. Not all people will use all 50. You work with your advisor on what the right number there is for you. So where and when is OCI, Amy?
So OCI will be held this year virtually on InternX. That is our virtual platform that will host the interviews. And as we get closer to OCI, which will be held in January, January 19th, 21st, and 25th, we will be sharing with you demo videos and instructions on how to use InternX. It's very, very easy to use from the student side. That's one reason why we chose it. And so you needn't worry. We will make sure that you feel very comfortable with the platform before the interview program happens. As I mentioned before, these are what are called screening interviews. So it's the first step in the interviewing process. These screening interviews may be followed by callback interviews, which is where an employer, if they meet you and they think that you might be a good fit for their firm, they might invite you to a quote-unquote callback interview with the firm, where you have the opportunity to meet with additional attorneys who work at that firm. Callbacks usually happen within the 2 to 3 weeks following OCI. And as far as we know, what we're hearing from employers is that those callbacks will also likely be virtual. And so more information about callbacks will be coming closer to January.
Yeah, and then there's often an attendance strategy around scheduling callbacks and preparing for them. We'll be preparing you for that a little bit closer to the date, but there may be some creative scheduling that has to take place with classes at that point. It's very hard to sort of give a universal piece of guidance as to the logistics on that now. Just know that there is a second stage to this, and it could carry on into February once we're done. So we've covered some of the basic logistics of OCI. The question we often get asked from a strategy perspective is, well, do I have to do it? I feel like everything's leading me toward this. Do I really have to? And the clear answer really is no. It's not a requirement by any stretch. This is the right program for people who want to work at a certain type of employer. It is not the right program for people who want to work at a different type of employer. We're going to discuss that. So the answer is no one has to do it, but we do find that many people are attracted to it, and we'll sort of list here some of the pros and cons that people have claimed to us when they think about, should I do OCI? And then you see on the pro side, certainly this is the way to connect with larger firms who are interested in recruiting. The way that these large firms recruit is through the 2L pipeline. You'll see here that we note the 3L market historically has been quite small, so it's not as though these firms are hiring in big numbers for 3Ls. It is for many a chance to explore the private sector because the 1L summer typically is in the public interest. In terms of the pros for people going to these large firms, we unpack this at Private Sector 101 and 201. Typically people tout the training, the exit opportunities to go to in-house, even some government and nonprofit roles enjoy the training that big firms provide to their attorneys. And then for some, it's just a more risk-averse process. There's a heavy procedural aspect to it. We're able to connect with a large swath of employers without having to do much legwork in terms of getting in front of them. So in terms of risk aversion, people tend to want to at least try it. Certainly though, there are cons. There really aren't many public sector employers that come to OCI. It is by and large firms, as Amy mentioned, some regional firms, maybe in-house counsel here and there, but we're not talking about public sector employers. As he said, it's typically not the province of small and mid-sized firms. And this practice may not simply be for everyone. So deciding which of these considerations is for you is a really good idea. If you're dead set on public interest, this is probably not a match. But if you're curious about the private sector, we typically say that it's a good idea to at least give it a chance. Above all else, though, do remember that you should be making your own pro and con list. We're here to help you with that. And either way, the first job you have out of law school is very much likely not to be the last job you have in the legal field. So people do move around, and there is portability in these careers. So do try to take a longer term view if you're stuck at all in terms of what the next step should be. We're going to turn it over to Amy to talk a little bit about the mechanics for doing OCI.
So how do you participate in OCI? Well, it's pretty easy. There are two requirements, one of which you're doing now, and that is to watch this information session so that you're familiar with the process, and so you know how bidding works, and you are kind of familiar with the logistics of the process. The second is the resume review, and most of you have probably already done this. But if you've not, then you'll want to submit a Word doc to your section advisor as soon as possible so that you've had your resume reviewed and that it's ready to go before bidding opens in November. So those are the two requirements to participation. That's if you want to do the bare minimum to participate in OCI. But there are other steps that we recommend. And you can consult your August 10th and October 14th section emails for guidance on those additional steps. We have great resources to use for researching law firms, for learning how to network, for learning how to engage with law firms. Getting your name in front of a firm early and often is a great way to get your resume out of the pile and get noticed by firms. And so, you know, taking some steps to familiarize yourself not only with the firms with which you would like to interview, but have the firms familiar with you could pay off in the long run. You'll want to conduct a mock interview. Practice makes perfect. And a lot of people think that they know how they're going to answer some of the more typical interview questions, but then when you're actually sitting in front of an employer and they ask you why you went to law school, frequently your mind turns blank. And so conducting a mock interview either with us or with a practitioner is a great way to practice your interview skills and make sure that you have answers ready to some of the questions that you may receive during the process. And then use the simplicity pathway to stay on track. The pathway lists these additional recommended steps and is a really great tracker to make sure that you're doing the things to put yourself in the most competitive position possible.
Great. So very light on the technical requirements, but as again, recommended steps are there and our resources will sort of shepherd you along there. from a strategy perspective, how one can do OCI and sort of maximize chances as a general strategy matter, really the goal here you want to keep in mind, you want to secure interviews, do your best secure interviews with employers who are a good match for you. And match is sort of a loaded term that's worth unpacking. Typically, we think of this as involving two sides of the table, right? One side of the table where you are, the student, often wants something out of the firm, either to work in a certain geographic area or attached to a city or a practice area that you really think you'd enjoy. You might care about how the firm assigns young associates their matters. Is it more free market or a little more structured? To what degree do you specialize at that firm? Are you going to be able to stay a generalist a little longer, or do you have to narrowly choose a field? Of course, issues like culture, pro bono, commitment to diversity may be significant factors for some. Prestige and compensation are things we hear from students again. So you want all those things from the firm. You're looking for that in a match. But we need to keep in mind that the firm is looking for certain things from the students as well. And we typically think of this, we've distilled them down to what we call 6 factors. You may recall that language that we use. But the firm is looking for academic performance, clearly. And that's typically encapsulated to a large degree in your grades here at law school. But they also are looking to your work in academic history, to see your professional antecedents, to see if you have any substantive knowledge that will relate to the work that you want to do. What we define as commercial intelligence. Do you understand how they run their business and how you'd fit in? Where would you sort of be situated and how can you serve clients best? Often this translates to something like practice area knowledge and understanding a bit about the firm hierarchy. Engagement, as Amy mentioned, is key for showing the firm that you really want to be there, that you're worth them taking a chance on, and for gauging for yourself if you want to be there as well. Firms are committed to diversity, to bringing in underrepresented voices. They are making much more of a push on that, so that's another factor. And then finally, how will you interview? Can you convince the firm that you really want to be there? So let's keep in mind when you're sort of looking at matches and looking at firms on your OCI list and on your broader, what we call free market list, if you think back to the resource where we describe the free market list, what firms might be a good match for you? Okay, so in thinking about that, often I think students will have a very sort of rigid view on what the grades piece means. And we, as many of you know, circulate a GPA report that lists historical GPA trends for some of these firms. So that report itself is housed on our OCI page. And again, it gives you the 25th percentile, 50th percentile, and 75th percentile GPA points for students who have accepted offers at certain firms over the past few years. We give you the data where we have enough data points to protect anonymity. So that's a helpful metric for what the selectivity of a firm might be, right? When you're looking about the match, how selective a firm is kind of helpful, and the GPA report gives you a sense of that. So you'd want to use it to sort of gauge selectivity, to gauge competitiveness, and to look where you are. Now we're in a strange year, obviously, where people only have one semester of grades and then a semester of passes. So to some degree, what you're looking at is how might the grades change when you're thinking about a bid list, because you're going to have to turn around your bid list in January in short order, and sort of maybe projecting to have a GPA, a bid list for where you are now and where you could go, depending on some of the grades that come out in January. We're going to have a whole number of unreported firms that come to OCI that we simply don't have data on. And often we get the question, well, how will I know how selective they are? And we have here a few ways that you can triangulate selectivity as you're thinking about that first piece of the match for these firms. You might look if we have data for other offices, and there's 2 or 3 data points for other offices of that firm. It's a pretty good guess that office you're looking at without data, maybe the GPA is pretty similar. Right? You might take a look at the firm's relative rankings in a given geographic area. And if they're top of the charts in all these rankings, it's a pretty fair bet that they're selective. Similarly, you might look at the bios of Georgetown alums on their website. And if all those alums have very top credentials, it might be a good indication that that's a very selective firm. You can also discuss with an advisor to get a little bit of a better sense of that for yourself. So we want you to understand that at the end of the day, that grades are not the entire game here. As we said, we've presented you with a menu of factors that these firms consider, and grades are a driver. Let's not be mistaken about that. And they should impact who you just sort of determine are your good matches here. but do look to your other plus factors, right? The other factors for recruiting, to think about how you might be able to look even more attractive to a firm if the grades aren't a perfect match. Now, how far out of the selectivity band you decide to go has as much to do with your level and your appetite for risk as anything else. Some students really want to bet on themselves and think all the plus factors are going to overcome. More risk-averse students will say, well, I don't want to bet on that. I want to hew a little bit closer to what the GPAs tell us. We typically advise that students look at firms where the grades are at, where your grades are at or below the median. So you'll want to be a little bit careful about looking at that chart, but these are certainly some of the factors that can push you over the edge for that. So having discussed a little bit about strategy there, and you should personalize that with your advisor, Amy's going to talk a little bit more about the process, the general process for OCI.
Yeah, so we use what's called a hybrid scheduling system, which means that part of every employer's schedule is determined by their selection and part is determined by a lottery. So at Georgetown, an interview schedule is typically 21 20-minute interviews. And so 30% of the schedule is based on the employer's choice. So they get to select 6 candidates that they would like to meet with. The other 15 candidates are selected via a lottery. So once you submit your bids into the Simplicity system, every firm for which you bid will receive your resume. They will not know where you bid them, but they will all receive your resume. It's very important to note that they will not know where you rank them, because and the reason we don't tell you is the reason that we don't tell them is because we want to make sure that their choices are not influenced by student bids. So resumes, as I mentioned, are forwarded to employers after the bidding deadline, and only resumes. Cover letters are not to be used in an OCI. After the bidding deadline, the employer has 24 hours to review student resumes and get back to us with their pre-select choices. We put those pre-select choices into Simplicity, and then Simplicity runs an algorithm that assigns lottery interviews for the remaining slots. And those lottery interviews are based on student rankings of firms. So we mentioned before that you will have 50 bids. It is important to note that when you're putting your bids into Simplicity, your number 1 bid is the firm with which you would want to interview the most. The 50th bid is the one that you care about interviewing with the least. We will work with each student to come up with a bid list strategy that makes sense for them. Everybody's bid list strategy is different. We plan to release a video and we'll have resources on creating a bid list strategy. At this point, as Rob mentioned, you're in the mode of creating a free market list, and you'll work to narrow down that bid list and alter it if need be once grades come out at a later point. One thing to think about, and we mentioned that everybody who bids on you gets your resume. There may be strategic reasons why you would want to put a firm higher or lower on your list, knowing that they receive your resume. If it's a firm that you've already had a lot of contact with, but they get a lot of, but they receive a lot of bids from Georgetown students because they have offices in really popular locations, maybe you would want to put them a little bit lower on your list just to make sure that they get your resume, with the thought that you'll be able to follow up with them if you don't get an interview. You'll want to think back to the networking that you've done and the 6 factors that Rob mentioned. Those do become important when you're creating your bid list. And again, everybody's bid list is different, so we encourage you to see your advisor to come up with a strategy that makes the most sense for you.
Yeah, and just as a couple more points here on the bid list, and I think one thing worth reiterating from Amy's point is that the bid list and the lottery itself is really trying to solve for a scarcity problem. Often the firms are coming to interview a high number of Georgetown students, 60, 80, 100 or so. but maybe more students want to work at that firm. So the lottery system is a way to sort of distribute those interviews, those interview slots in something like a fair way. That's why we have an algorithm randomly assign students a lottery position. And if you should rank a firm high enough and the firm is available for you, you'll get that interview. If you should rank the firm not high enough and a classmate ranks it a little bit higher, enough classmates, that interview slot won't be available. And as Amy suggested, there are certain popular locations, New York and DC among them, where firms tend to be quite popular. Typically, those would have to go a little bit higher on the list. But hey, maybe you can put a little bit lower on your list because of all the pre-OCI engagement you did with that firm leaves you feeling a little bit more secure that they'll give you an interview outside of the process. So the best way to beat this bid list game that you do sort of via simplicity is to go around it by doing some of that pre-OCI engagement that we've discussed. And these are just a few more strategy points to hit home about that bid list. As Amy mentioned, you're in that free market posture now. We're going to give you more guidance on the strategy of creating a bid list. We don't want you to worry too much about the details, here in mid-October. This is really for a later date, but there's some overview of the strategy there. So one closing thought as we finish is we often get the question, what are my chances in OCI? And we can't reiterate enough how that really is very difficult to say, because it really has a lot to do with how much effort you put into researching these firms, engaging with these firms, and giving yourself a very good chance there. It also has a lot to do with which firms you try to interview with, right? If every firm on your list is a bit of what you might call a reach firm in terms of selectivity, or a difficult firm to even get an interview with because of popularity, well, the chances might look a little bit lower. But if you are someone who's really optimizing all of those factors and being very judicious about which firms you try to interview with and those that you do interview with, then your chances look better. In terms of the numbers, typically speaking, we have about 600 participants every year. Over the last few years, it's been about 300, 350 or so people have accepted offers, not gotten offers, right? Accepted those offers from this. So, that doesn't tell you strictly what the percentages are, because it really does have a lot to do with some of the choices that you make along the way. But there's some raw numbers to give you a little bit of context. So in closing, we're going to flash a slide with a lot of information on it. Know that this slide is going to be available to come back to, and we're going to be reminding you of these things. But Amy's going to review some of the very key dates, especially that the date about the bids closing.
Yes, so employers are viewable in Simplicity October 13th. So you can log into Simplicity. You can click on OCI on the left-hand side. You'll want to choose January 2021 OCI among the sessions, and it will bring up the current list of employers that we have participating in OCI. One thing to note is that we are adding employers every day. And so you'll want to make sure that you check Simplicity regularly to see which employers have been added. In October through December, you're going to want to practice interviewing through doing mock interviews. We will also release a interview workshop webinar, which will give some tips and tricks for making the most of your interviews. But really practicing your interview is the best way to ensure that you are comfortable when it comes to OCI in January, or really when it comes to doing any interviews. So we really strongly encourage you to do a mock interview with someone in our office. On November 9th, bidding opens. Again, this is through Simplicity. You will have a long bidding period. Bidding will run until January 13th at 12 p.m. Now you'll notice that grades come out, we believe the grades will be coming out on January 11th. And we wanted to make sure that you had enough time between when grades are released and the bidding deadline to make any necessary alterations to your bid list. But you'll note that turnaround time is very, very tight, probably less than 48 hours between when grades are released and then when you need to submit your bids. So to Rob's earlier point about a free market list, it's really important that you've done a lot of this research ahead of time so that you have a nice little quote unquote skeleton list to work on that you can alter if you need to once your grades are released. Bidding closes at 12 p.m. on the 13th, and that is a hard and fast deadline. We have no room or no flexibility for students who have missed the deadline for whatever reason. Because as soon as bidding closes, we send the resumes to the employers, and then they only have 24 hours to get back to us with their pre-selects. So it's a really tight deadline, and we can't emphasize that enough. So if you plan to participate in OCI, make sure that you have these deadlines in your head so that you're prepared when the time comes. We plan to release preliminary schedules on January 15th, and we call them preliminary because these are the schedules that have the interviews that you will receive through the pre-select and lottery portion of the process. As we mentioned before, there are additional ways to obtain interviews, and you can do that through the next little bit here, the opt-in and open signups. More information about these two processes can be found in the student manual, but we'll talk more about that as we get closer to OCI, and we'll explain what that means. But they do provide an opportunity for you to gain additional interviews, ones that come up through the cancellation period, which is also noted January 15th through 18th. And then any slots that weren't filled originally through the lottery. You can cancel an interview that you've received anytime between January 15th and January 18th. After the 18th, you'll need to have talked to an advisor or a member of the OCS recruitment team in order to cancel your interview. And then OCI is January 19th, 21st, and 25th. Again, it's via InternX. And as we get closer to OCI, we'll provide you with some tips and tricks to make the most of doing these interviews virtually, things that you'll want to think about. And certainly, as I mentioned before, you'll have the opportunity to see demos of how InternX works. So, we are here to hold your hand and guide you throughout this process. We really do think of ourselves as partners with you, and we encourage you to make an appointment with your advisor to come up with a strategy that works best for you.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you all for tuning in.